on Reality Check Radio, where we discuss politics, power, and culture. You can text us your thoughts on 2057 and email questions to inbox@realitycheck.radio. We are joined now by Tom Rossel, who is known better as Survive The Jive, and he has a YouTube channel by that name. He is an Anglo-Saxon historian and a filmmaker. He studied the medieval period, also Norse paganism, and his content focuses on the historical discipline. And for the last 5 years, he has been battling left-wing woke academics who want to ban the term Anglo-Saxon and even now the word Viking from universities and the history books. He joins us now. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much for having me.
And it's been a while since we've talked with someone from the UK on the show, and quite a few interesting things have happened there in the UK. You've had a new government, Labour government, Keir Starmer. You've had riots that happened recently, and quite, I think, very punitive punishments have been placed on people who participated in those riots, and there's been accusations of two-tier policing. Have you got any, I guess, context for the New Zealand audience on what the situation on the ground in the UK is right now, looking back over the last few months?
Well, this is something that's been boiling up for arguably since at least the 1970s, because when Enoch Powell started to make warnings of it. But it's especially reached a fever pitch since, increasingly worse since mass immigration on a huge scale began under the new Labour government at the end of the 1990s, turn of the millennium. But actually it reached like a third level of extreme numbers under the recent Conservative government. And it's funny because every single election in the UK, every single election or vote that's including the Brexit vote, which is not an election, but every single time the British public has had an opportunity, they have always voted for less immigration. When there's the Tory party has come to power several times on an anti-immigration ticket, but they've never delivered. And Brexit, despite what all the pundits were saying about what it was really, what do they want? Why do they want? For most of the people who voted Brexit, it was really a simple thing about not wanting so many immigrants. Now, of course, people who understood knew that Brexit would never actually, there's nothing about the Brexit vote that would guarantee fewer immigrants. But that was what the sentiment behind it was about, because people just thought, like, if we take back control, then maybe we can prevent there being so many immigrants. But after Brexit, the Tories actually increased immigration. Some people might say they even did it as punishment of the people who voted for Brexit. They wanted to punish them with it. But anyway, even if that's not true, the fact remains that immigration increased significantly. And then the Labour government came to power over in July, and that wasn't really due to them they didn't get any extra vote in England compared to the previous election. They're pretty much the same as before, and that was considered a bad turnout that time. But they won this time because, partly because Scotland voted for them en masse. A lot of the Scottish Nationalist Party supporters left them and supported Labour instead. Scotland's not that much of the vote. It was more to do with the fact that people were so fed up with the Tories and failing on immigration that the Tories lost a huge amount of their voters who switched to Lib Dem and Reform. And that just allowed Labour to win by default. And then a black person stabbed a bunch of English children. Some of them died. People got really angry, naturally. And this just happened to follow a couple of other events, one of which was a Romanian child was an attempt to take a Romanian child into custody resulted in a bunch of Romanians, probably Roma. When we say Romanian, they're not really Romanians. They're Roma gypsies of Indian, or originating in India. But they kicked off and burnt the bus and started smashing up the town. And the police reaction under Labour was very like easy, softly. Similarly, and this is all within two weeks of each other. This happened, and then this also happened. A video released of police kicking a Muslim man at the airport, and that was basically like a riot of Muslims getting really angry, saying this police brutality. Then the rest of the video was released, and it turned out that this Muslim had been assaulting female police officers and extremely violent in the airport. And then they'd clipped the video and only shown after he had finally been subdued. One of the policemen kicked him in the head, but he would have been extremely violent, and it was quite justifiable in the circumstances. But anyway, the reaction from Starmer and the Labour government to that had been, we have to be soft and easy and understanding on them. And then immediately afterwards, you have a far more legitimate cause of disorder on the part of the natives over several children being murdered by an outlander. And the reaction was totally different, totally different. And it was a reaction of extreme prejudice and authoritarianism and repression, and saying we need to be talking about well, Starmer said they have this completely illegitimate. Their actions are completely illegitimate, as he's saying. So what that did, just by the fact those other two riots and the reaction to them was so fresh in the memory, it made it very, very clear to even the simplest of the proletariat that there was a two-tier system, and that they were second-class citizens compared to Roma gypsies or Muslims or the protected groups that the Labour government love. So rather than diffusing the situation as a skilled statesman would have done, what Starmer and his government did was inflame it. And as a result, the riots got worse and worse, and they weren't rioting about the murdered children anymore. They were rioting about the two-tier justice. And although the riots have stopped, that sentiment is there now, and the cat's out the bag. Starmer, his government is extremely unpopular, following a government that probably one of the least popular governments ever we had. No one liked Sunak. Rishi Sunak was extremely unpopular. The Conservative government were extremely unpopular at the time they went out, and it didn't seem like there was possible for Labour to make things worse. It was almost like they've been, scored. The other team had scored an own goal, and it would be very simple for them to manage. But somehow Starmer has fumbled it, and he's completely messed things up. He's now extremely unpopular, and the country is more divided than ever.
And that is, what a terrible situation that you have to deal with there in the UK. And I think I saw even that he's letting thousands of criminals out of jail early so that he can basically put protesters in prison.
1,700, I believe. So not quite thousands, but nearly 2,000. 1,700 criminals we released. They needed to be able to make threats to arrest his political enemies, because otherwise he knew they could run rampant and he can't threaten them with anything because the prisons are practically full. That's already a problem because crime is spiraling out of control, because the criminals are realizing that the prisons are full. But the priority for a state has to be the security of the state, not the security of the people. And so he's more concerned with his political enemies than the actual dangerous criminals on the street. But so he had to release 1,700. Some of them have already immediately offended. A rapist already has raped someone, I think, being let out. Some people are calling it the Starmy army of rapists, or Starmer's rapist army. They're like his shock troops, basically. But I mean, whether he's released them deliberately with the intention of intimidating the populace and, saying that we have the power to let criminals terrorize you and you can't do anything about it, or whether it's just sheer incompetence and that he just wanted to be able to arrest his political enemies and needed to let dangerous criminals out in the streets to do it, it's not clear. But the effect is the same. It's made him even less popular with the public.
Well, I do have some bad news for you, because you've got 5 years to go until you can get rid of that, at least with regular elections. In New Zealand, we actually had a similar situation. We had a Labour government, and they had a policy to reduce the prison population, which just meant letting people out of prison, like not arresting criminals. That's how they reduced the prison population. Crime went through the roof here in New Zealand as well, and eventually they were tossed out. And now we have a tough on crime government, and all of it, it feels like it goes around in circles, unfortunately, and it's one tough on crime government, one easy on crime government, and that's just a sad reality of politics. But I think rather than just talking about politics the whole time, let's talk a little bit about history. But before I ask about the term Anglo-Saxon being banned from universities, I noticed that your most recent YouTube series is titled The Hyperborean Odyssey. And I really wanted to ask, what is Hyperboria?
Hyperboria is Greek, and it means extreme north, furthest north. And there were some Greek sort of legends that go right back in time to before even the Greeks started writing things down, of a happy land in the north. Now, originally, this may have actually referred to a real place. Probably, in my view, it was the Nordic Bronze Age Sweden, because these myths in Greece of like this northern warm place in the north of Europe and the extreme north, but it was warm and pleasant, and they could grow grapes. Well, during the Bronze Age, there was a warm period, and Scandinavia was very warm. The Swedish people in the Nordic Bronze Age wore quite skimpy garments, and they were capable of growing grapes. It was warm enough, and there was a great culture there with a lot, quite wealthy because of the trade of amber. There were some elites of the Nordic Bronze Age. I've made several videos about the Nordic Bronze Age if you'd like to know about that. That's probably what it referred to originally. However, by the time you reach like the golden age of ancient Greece and the first ever historian, Herodotus, no one actually remembers where Hyperborea is. And it's become associated with some of the gods and things. Apollo was said to be from Hyperborea in some versions. Some myths he's from what's now Turkey, and some others he's from Hyperborea. But he's has this connection to Hyperborea, and no one's sure where it is. And Herodotus is when he went into what's now Ukraine to speak to Scythians, he's asking these steppe nomads, "Where's Hyperborea? Do you know?" And they're like, "Don't know what you're talking about." No. That's about as far north as most Greeks would ever go, like the northern shores of the of the Pontic Sea, but the Black Sea. But so it became this thing of legend. And then in the early modern era and the modern era, with Romanticism and nationalism emerging, a lot of the northern nations start to want to have like a legacy, a history that's a more earlier than recorded history of them. So the first like mentions of the Germanic and Celtic peoples is usually the Romans around 2,000 years ago. But wanting to push further back using only historical sources because they didn't have very much or very good archaeology, and they had no archaeogenetics like now. So they would say, we're the Hyperboreans, and Hyperborea becomes like a kind of a way of referring to the ancient greatness of Northern European nations. And they're all saying, arguing about where Hyperborea is, saying, no, we're the Hyperboreans, no, you are. So the German, like Nietzsche famously wrote, we must face ourselves, we are Hyperboreans. So like when in sort of tongue-in-cheek, ironic humor on the internet now, there's this sort of reference to the fact that Hyperborean identity is kind of synonymous with a sort of schizophrenic mental illness. Like people who call themselves Hyperboreans are sort of like delusional nationalists who want to like associate themselves with this like imaginary kingdoms where people rode on woolly mammoth and things like that. So because in my series I've done this tour, I was working on a cruise ship around Norway and the northern islands of the Atlantic and Scotland and stuff. So I thought, instead of calling it Norway and Scotland, I call it Hyperborea because it's very far north, and then it'll attract people who love that sort of humor.
That's very clever. It reminds me a little bit of a different kind of old story. When I was researching my wife's family tree, she's mostly so Scottish. We've got these annals of the clans that go right back, the High Kings of Ayr, and then they go all the way back to Scythia, the descendants of the Scythians, and they went to Egypt, and they were descended from one of the pharaohs, one of the daughters of Pharaoh. The story of Moses, and so I refer to her as my Egyptian princess now because she's descended from the Egyptians. So it's very common then for people to build up these stories. I'm not sure what era that traces from, whether it's the Middle Ages or earlier. But
that's an interesting one. It's a similar thing. It's a similar sort of motivation as that the early modern desire to be like for nationalists to push their identity back. But that's medieval. So medieval Christian monks writing about the histories of their people across Northern Europe, from Iceland, in Scotland, and Ireland, they wanted as well to give themselves a bit more dignity by extending their history back before, and since the only written sources they had from very ancient history were the Bible and some ancient Greek sources and Roman sources. It was mostly Roman because they'd lost most Greek literature, so it was mostly Greek via Roman. So things like the Aeneid by Virgil and the Bible were very important for constructing identities. Of course, everyone knew about the Egyptians because they're in the Bible and they're in Roman sources. So, that's if we say we want to be ancient, then we can say we'll connect you to the to the to the Egyptians. The Scythians are also mentioned in the Bible, so you've got an ancient people. So everything had to be like rejigged to fit in with the new biblical narrative that they'd adopted because they became Christian. Of course, Scottish people have no ancestry from Scythians or Egyptians. That is important to understand, that that is not part of Scotland or Irish history. The Scythians or the Egyptians have nothing to do with it at all. Some people today have like sort of read these medieval fake histories and sort of tried to make them sound real, but we know better than ever what Egyptian and Scythian DNA is like, and what ancient Scottish DNA is like, and the migrations that led to the formations of these peoples, and they're not related at all.
And so, where does the genetic lineage from the Celtic people come from, and does it connect to the Anglo-Saxon people as well? Since I know that's the main attack, I think, is not from these academics, which we'll talk about in a minute, is targeted at Anglo-Saxons, not as at Celts, I guess. And what is the difference there between the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons then?
Well, the terms Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Viking have all been criticised in academia in recent years. But whereas Anglo-Saxon and Viking have been criticised specifically for allegedly far-right associations, Celtic has been criticised for a more legitimate reason, which is that no one ever called themselves Celtic in these so-called Celtic regions. Like, Anglo-Saxons actually called themselves Anglo-Saxons. The word Viking is a Norse word for a pirate. Celt is not even a word in the Celtic languages that we know of. Celt is used, Keltoi is used by the Greeks to refer to one Celtic tribe that lived near them or that they were aware of. But they didn't even refer to all Celtic peoples as Keltoi, just one. And then in the 18th century, early antiquarians, British antiquarians, started to use quite presciently, they understood that there was a connection between the Celtic cultures and the Celtic language families. And so they termed this whole group Celtics. So, and that actually, they were correct, that the languages spoken on the British Isles, like the Brythonic, which became Cornish and Welsh, and Gaelic, which is associated with Ireland and the Scottish islands, like the Outer Hebrides, these were related to the lost languages of continental Europe, such as they're spoken by the Gauls. They were right about that. But they weren't right that they were all one race. And in fact, now we can see that the migrations that brought Celtic languages to the British Isles from France, which began sometime around 1000 BC-ish, were not. They have brought DNA from France, which is in all the people of the British Isles, but it's not very much in Scotland and Ireland. So actually, the Scottish and the Irish have the least amount of Celtic DNA in the British Isles. The highest amount is in the southeast, closer to France. So Celtic DNA, we're talking about the British Isles, we're just talking about French ancestry, basically, because the French today are still pretty much the same as Iron Age Gauls. And the migration of Celtic languages to Britain probably happened at the end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. Maybe that's a good 1,000 years before the Romans start talking about them. So we don't really know if they even called themselves Galli then. The word Gaul isn't actually related to the Galli. It seems like Gaul is actually a Germanic word related to the word Welsh. It means the same thing. It means someone who's not. It means a Romanized, non-Germanic foreigner, and it's a term the Franks used to refer to the Gallic peoples of what's now France. But the Germanic and Celtic-speaking peoples of northwestern Europe are related because they all come from the same Indo-European ancestral group of the Belbeker culture, which originated somewhere around the Lower Rhine, close in Holland, probably, the Netherlands, basically. And that culture spread all over Western Europe, down into Spain, and it replaced most of the people in Britain and Ireland around 4,500 years ago. But it also went up into Scandinavia and mixed with another Indo-European population that was already there. And the Germanic languages sort of emerged out of that. The Celtic languages come out of the Belbeker culture too, but not in Britain and Ireland. Rather, a migration from Holland into Central Europe, near the Alps, would have created the Celtic language would have come somewhere around there in the Bronze Age, and then the Celtic culture, the material culture associated with what's called the Hallstatt culture, is the emergence of material Celtic culture, and that spreads all the way from sort of South Germany into central Eastern France, and then that culture is extremely successful, associated with a lot of wealth, mining in the mountains. When mining is very important, they have access to salt mines and copper reserves in the Alps and things like that. They become an extremely influential culture. They're kind of like, you might even think of the Celtic culture as being like the pre-Roman culture. If like the Romans defined that Europe basically in, the first century AD especially, and a little bit before. Well, Celtic culture defined Europe, was the main culture of all of Europe in the first millennium BC. And it's therefore influential even materially on the Romans, like their lances and some of their other weapons and chariots are derived from Celtic designs. So that culture spread into Britain, but it doesn't come from Britain, and certainly not from Ireland. And the Irish are actually, it's coincidental that, because of the expansion of the Romans and the Germanic people later on, and the Slavic people later on, a lot of the Celtic regions became Slavic, Germanic, and Latin speaking instead. But because of the peripheral nature of Scotland and Ireland, they retained the Celtic languages. But that isn't because they're a pure version of the Celtic race. In fact, they don't have very much Central European ancestry at all. And the French are still pretty much, as they were in the Iron Age. And South Germans actually have quite a lot of Celtic ancestry, and not as Germanic as people think just because they're called German. So that's about what I can say about Celts, at least.
Well, that was very, very fascinating. Although the key thing that I'm going to take away is that everything started in Holland, which is where my ancestry comes from. So I'll just take credit for everything, I guess.
Yeah.
But this brings us to an interesting point then, because for the last 5 years, you've been fighting with these academics in the universities that have basically now culminated with the University of Nottingham deleting Anglo-Saxon studies and Viking studies. You've been fighting them for 5 years. And as I understand it, the key thing that they're denying roughly is that there was a Saxon migration, an Anglo-Saxon. Angles, at least this is what I learned in history, Angles, the Jutes and the Saxons invaded the British Isles, and that's where the Anglo-Saxons come from. And as I understand, that's roughly being challenged, and that they want to get rid of that part of history. Is that a correct understanding of why they're getting rid of Anglo-Saxon?
Not quite, not quite. Well, I divide this whole saga of 5 years into three stages. Now, the third stage is Nottingham University wanting to remove the term Anglo-Saxon from its literature and historical courses. Last year, Cambridge University did something similar, and but this all began in 2019. And when I kicked off about it, was the president of the Anglo-Saxon International Society of Anglo-Saxonists happened to be a woman of color who is actually not really that interested in Anglo-Saxons. She's a Marxist racial activist, and in North America, and she said, I quote her. Here she says, dismantling the system means changing the way our field, medieval studies, is structured, and that means essentially burning it down. Something that people who are not prepared to do because they spend time and money learning Old English, Old Norse, Old Irish, whatever. Those languages have saved absolutely zero people in our present day. So she's basically saying like the study of medieval languages and history is counter-revolutionary because it doesn't save people of color from the alleged prejudices they said. And the only reason for medieval studies to exist is to serve these downtrodden groups, these marginalized people of color, as she sees it. So as far as she's concerned, the fact that medieval studies is devoted to the study of like these ancient peoples like Old Irish and Old Norse and Old English speakers, and people are learning those languages, is actually evidence that it's white supremacy. And so she's, that's what people don't realize. The actual intention of banning Anglo-Saxon is really a Marxian subversion. And if you read her, listen to her interviews and read stuff she recommends, she says like young medievalists should just be reading racial Marxist theories who don't even tell you anything about medieval history. This is about like Marxian third worldism and things like that. That's what she's really interested in. She's somehow found herself in medieval studies, and she's deciding to tear it all down. Now, originally, in 2019, they were, as you were saying, denying the migration. And that was part of the justification for, she was trying to ban the word Anglo-Saxon within academia, partly because she said, it was three things really, like, and Eric Wade, her colleague, was going along with it. They said, one, the Anglo-Saxons didn't really use the term Anglo-Saxon. Well, that's not true. And I can give lots of examples where they definitely did refer to themselves as Anglo-Saxons, if you're interested in that. Secondly, they questioned, whether the migration even happened, and that wasn't just Marxists doing that. There were a few academics at the time who still questioned. Ever since the 1960s up until 2019, there were lots of people questioning whether it happened. But that has subsequently been completely stopped because in 2016, there was a paper that showed it was a small study, but it showed genetic evidence of the migration. But in 2022, they did a repeat version of that study, but much larger, with hundreds of samples of Anglo-Saxon skeletons. And it became absolutely impossible to deny that there was a large migration of Germanic people into Britain in the 5th century, and that they contributed between a quarter to half of the DNA of all English people even today. And that at the time, it formed an 80% replacement of people in Eastern England. At that time. So they've dropped that from the thing. They're not denying the migration now, but they are still using the other reason which Mary Ramber Olm and Eric Wade had used to justify the ban of Anglo-Saxon, which is that it's racist. And they say it's racist because it's allegedly been used in racist contexts within modern American history. And they say it's white supremacist narratives of ethnic identity, that the American founding fathers referred to themselves as Anglo-Saxons. Therefore, it's problematic and it needs to be removed. Well, it's not surprising that, after she tried to ban it in 2019, and after I made a big fuss on a stream about it, a lot of academics, like 70 or 80 academics, signed a petition not to ban the use of Anglo-Saxon in academia, saying it's a useful term and an appropriate term. But majority of those academics were British. And I think that's because the racial politics that she uses to attack medieval studies don't really have equivalents in Britain, or maybe they do in New Zealand, I don't know. But is the term Anglo-Saxon is not considered a racist word in Britain. It doesn't have those connotations. And they're trying to force it. And at first it was very big pushback in 2020 with the petition. But by 2023, Cambridge University, one of our main universities, banned so actually went along with Ramber and Olm's 2019 recommendations. And now Nottingham University, not a significant university, has done the same. There's only 2 universities so far in Britain, but that's bad. That's a bad trend. And both times the media, in 2019, the mainstream media didn't cover that story. It was just my stream and then the academics at first, and then later on. But last year, when Cambridge made the ban, and this year when Nottingham did, both times the mainstream media have reported negatively on those decisions. So it is now, the tables are turning, and more people are like opposing this. And it's good to see that Oxford and UCL and other big universities in UK aren't going along with this. So it isn't like happening across academia. But it's quite worrying that any are, especially since Mary Ramber Olm has since sort of retreated from academia, and she's not really doing anything anymore. She was the one who started all this, but there are other people like Helen Young and Eric Wade who are equally, Kim something or other. There's a lot of these kind of like far left racial or political activists who use medieval studies as a way to attack Western civilization.
Here in New Zealand, I think the term Anglo-Saxon doesn't get used much. I hear it mostly from the American context of the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, which is often though used in like a derogatory way even. But it is very common, I guess, to refer to British people with usually the term British or Anglo, just Anglo by itself. And I have heard the Australian nationalists more so gravitate towards Anglo-Celtic, because same thing in New Zealand as in Australia, the very large mix of Irish, Scottish, English, and Welsh people. What are your views then on, I guess, the use of the term Anglo that we use out here in the colonies, and as opposed to Anglo-Saxon? And also, I have heard objections from people who then complain, if you say Anglo, well, what about the Saxons and the Jutes? What about the Normans and the Celts and Picts and Britons and Dutch and Frisians and so on? Is Anglo like a good word to use for people who are of British descent?
Well, first I'm going to address the use of the term Anglo-Saxon. The migrations of Angles, Saxons, Utes, and some even Franks probably contributed, and Frisians, all contributed, all happened around the 5th century. The main groups, though, genetics have shown that of those Germanic migrations were at the Angles and the Saxons. That probably explains why, after they migrated, within a century or two, they start referring to themselves, after they start mixing together with each other, so that there are no longer Angles and Saxons so much, and also having mixed with the native Britons. And they formed a new ethnic group. And the first, as soon as it's formed, before England is a nation, Bede wrote the Gentis Anglorum, the ecclesiastical history of the Gentis Anglorum, the English race. So Anglorum is Latin for Anglish, and Anglish is Old English for English. So, and then also around the same time, some people use in Latin Anglo-Saxonum, which is Latin for Anglo-Saxon. So the terms English and Anglo-Saxon arrive at the same time, and they refer to the same thing. So English comes from Anglo, and Anglo-Saxon is a combination of Anglo and Saxon, but neither refer exclusively to the Angles and Saxons or exclusively to the Angles. Both of them refer to, more broadly, all the Germanic-speaking peoples of Britain at that time. And so it never excluded the Jutes or anything. It doesn't exclude anything. It's an all-encompassing term that's not used until a long time after the migration. So it isn't a term to refer to the migrants arriving in the 5th century. It's a term used to refer to the ethnic English group. And Anglo-Saxon has always been a synonym of English. It's not that they're two different things. And even these far-left Marxists are recommending that we, instead of Anglo-Saxon, they say we should use early English. And that actually, there's nothing wrong with that suggestion of theirs. I don't oppose that, because early English has always been a synonym for Anglo-Saxon. It doesn't really matter that much. I'm not really bothered about people referring to Anglo-Saxons as early English, because it means the same thing. But what I am worried about is telling us we can't say Anglo-Saxon, because that has a sort of implication that I find offensive. But these within British English, we generally prefer to refer to ourselves as English, and then use the term Anglo-Saxon to refer to our global diaspora. And the French have enhanced that. So in France, when they say, they refer to us as Anglais from Angle, even though the settlers nearest to France were Saxons, not Angles. It was quite interesting, because the Welsh refer to, and the Celtic peoples of the British Isles refer to us as Sassenach from Saxon, even though the northern part of England was settled by Angles. And the southern part was settled by Saxons, but the people in France refer to us as Anglais, and pretty much all of Europeans refer to us as some derivative of Angle, so Inglaterra, whatever. In modern history, the French have used the term Anglo-Saxon to refer to the diaspora of English-speaking people. So when they say Anglo-Saxon, they would include the Scots, the Americans, New Zealanders, Australians, and they use it mostly as a pejorative to say, the Anglo-Saxon things like that they don't like. So they're talking about the transatlantic relationship of Britain and America that they don't like, or something like that. And sometimes that has been contracted to Anglo recently. So Anglo as a sort of a shorthand for Anglo-Saxon, and it's within these contexts of French usage, it's usually used in a pejorative sense to criticize us for having bad food or for having different attitudes to the French. And so in continental criticisms of the British and American culture, shared culture, the term Anglo-Saxon was widely used. And then in the internet culture, this transferred across, and it mixed with the fact that in America, Anglo had this association with the upper class American settlers, sometimes called WASPs. And sort of, it got lost in translation, like the European pejorative use of Anglo-Saxon, and a kind of like American resentment among like lower class and Ellis Islander type Americans of, maybe Italian, Jewish, or Irish descent, who use the term Anglo as a pejorative for the country club, civilized, attendees of Yale, kind of well-heeled Americans. and it kind of mixed up. And then somehow in the last 10, 15 years, Anglo has become used in America to refer to English people, which is never, that was never what it's used. Or Anglo, Americans use Anglo to mean something other than themselves, which is a very recent use of that term. But this is mostly, I think, confined to within the internet usage of the term. But yeah, that's why it can get somewhat confusing. If you're reading a 20th century literature and they're criticizing the Anglo-Saxons, they're almost certainly criticizing Americans. If you see someone online complaining about Anglos in the last 10 years, they're probably talking about the British. So yeah, the usage is evolving as the language does.
Yes, and that's, I think, language is organic in that sense, and we shouldn't get too attached to, overly attached to like arguing the semantics of what particular era a word has a meaning for. And I think this is why then in the New Zealand census, for instance, they refer to like European New Zealanders, kind of, I think, over time it's been a very neutral term to catch everything under the term European here in New Zealand, even though it mostly refers to people of British descent.
Almost entirely Northwest European settlers, right?
Yes,
It's
it is as well.
it's
Yeah.
British, it's
So
British
some
and
French.
Irish. And Ireland was part of Britain at the time the Irish came, so it's basically British settlers and a few Dutch as
Yeah,
well.
so a few Dutch, a few French, a few Swedes, and so on. But yeah, by Northwestern Europe
Mm.
is one of the all the genetic studies that you've referred to and defending Anglo-Saxon as a term, in the medieval studies that you do, you will undoubtedly be encountering accusations of racism from these woke academics. And as you've already mentioned, that's really the cause of one of the reasons why they want to get rid of this term, why they want to erase it completely. Is this, do you see this as causing ongoing tension then, or like the specter of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and kind of interfering with the post-racial, modern, liberal, diverse, multi-ethnic societies they're trying to build in England, in New Zealand, in America? How does this all interact with this?
Well, when I was studying at uni, my master's degree in 2011, there was no genetic studies that could confirm the Anglo-Saxon migration. So anyone would refer. The arguments were always based on one, the lack of archaeological evidence. They said, oh, there's no actual archaeological evidence of an invasion of Anglo-Saxons, which I always thought strange because suddenly you see loads of Germanic artifacts. But people like Francis Pryor and others at the time would argue, oh, that's just the adoption of the material culture from the continent by the indigenous British people and doesn't reflect a change. But I couldn't believe that suddenly overnight, all these like formerly Romanized Celtic people of Britain would just switch to speaking a Germanic language, rename every single village across the whole island with a Germanic name, and start using these very specific forms of intricate Germanic art knotwork, which then comes to dominate and becomes the insular Celtic style art people call Celtic knots. There's nothing Celtic about their origins. They come from Germania, from Scandinavia and Germany. So those came into the British Isles with the Anglo-Saxons. And like we have Welsh sources, Geoffrey of Monmouth, say that the Anglo-Saxons invaded. Anglo-Saxon sources within 200 years of the migration saying we arrived. And but these like often left-wing people wanted to argue against that, saying, oh no, there's no good argument for this, this is just speculative, we don't have clear stuff. And what they used is the gaps in the history, like the fact that the Dark Ages has a dearth of evidence, as an opportunity to completely rewrite history. So there is a lack of evidence in the literary sources, but there are literary sources. And what they're trying to say is that the literary sources can't be trusted, so that there is nothing you can say for sure. Because they liked using these shadows in history to try and inject their ideology and say everything, since all that stuff about invasions was Victorian, racist, colonialist narratives. And once we reassess history, we can see something, blah, 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 blah. And then they inject whatever feminist or like globalist ideas that they like into the sort of ambiguity they've created by questioning every single piece of evidence and never providing any solid evidence for their alternative theories. But then everything turned upside down in 2015, and since then, when suddenly like genetic science took a huge step forwards with what's called the genomic revolution. And suddenly they were able to get very viable genetic samples from ancient skeletons at a much lower cost than ever before. So, there were genetic studies even in the 90s, but they were very expensive, very, very expensive, prohibitively expensive. And they only got a very small amount of the genome anyway. And that low coverage was not reliable because there was a very real risk of contamination by the scientists and their DNA going into the sample. But all those things were solved by 2015. And suddenly we could just get loads of skeletons and not just look at one skeleton and start speculating about a little bit of his DNA, but loads of skeletons and do genome-wide analysis of those studies of multiple skeletons from ancient times. So it completely changed history and archaeology and everything. What happened is that all the things that Victorians had said would happen, like the Indo-European invasions, the Belgica invasion of Britain, the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England, the Aryan invasion of India, all these things that since the 1960s, archaeologists and historians had been very confident and snootily saying how ridiculous these old Victorian racist theories were. All of them have been proven correct. And the main scholarship that the academia across the West has supported for the past 70 years has been shown to be completely false and based on nothing. So the landscape is of studying Anglo-Saxon is completely different to what it was when I was at university. It's what I wanted it to be. I was very excited at university about a study on Viking DNA that was happening at the time back in 2011. But that was only looking at modern people's DNA and speculating about what segments of modern people's DNA resembled that of modern Scandinavians, which is a way you can try to speculate on how much Viking DNA is in Britain, but it's nowhere near as conclusive as taking a Viking skeleton and looking at that DNA, because that's an actual Viking, not a modern Scandinavian. So that things have changed, and now they don't have that ammunition anymore. These huge shadowy periods of history are now being illuminated by genetic science, and what's being shown is that the conventional narratives of history are generally correct. There's been huge amounts of migrations and replacements and conflicts of various kinds, so now you would think that as a result, Ramber and Olm's attempts would disappear, but they didn't disappear because they weren't just dependent on claiming the Anglo-Saxon invasions didn't exist. They were dependent more on the fact that the word Anglo-Saxon hurts people's feelings, and those people are protected groups who are more important than white people. So that's basically the philosophy of the modern left. It's you have to cater for allegedly marginalized and suffering groups. These are protected categories, and therefore their concerns are more important than anyone else's, including if that means completely destroying the culture and legacy of an entire people, an ethnic group, just pretending the English ethnic group don't exist and that our history is illegitimate, just to cater for the feelings of a few non-white people living on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
And yeah, we have all these resources here in New Zealand as well that go into protecting, preserving the Maori as a distinct people, as their ethnic group, to research their history and protect it. And then you hear this from England, where it's we have our native people, the English, but we're going to try and erase them. The complete opposite. And as you say, it's purely ideological. There's nothing else about it, really.
Yeah. Good to compare the Maori because they've been in New Zealand for 800-900 years or something like that.
Yeah,
and
they're considered 50, basically, yeah.
Yeah, so they're considered the indigenous people. They came from Polynesia. Well, Anglo-Saxons invaded 1500 years ago, and we have texts describing us as an ethnic group from the 8th century. So yeah, at least 1300 years of recorded history of us identifying as the English ethnic group, and that we've been on the island for 1500 years. And that should make us indigenous from that alone. But also the fact that although up to half of our DNA comes from the Germanic invaders, the Anglo-Saxons were also mixed with the previous inhabitants. So we also have ancestry going back 4,500 years, 4,500 years to the first Bell Beaker invasion of Britain. So if we can't be considered an ethnic group, then there are no ethnic groups. If the English aren't an ethnic group, there are no ethnic groups, because there are almost hardly any ethnic groups on the entire planet who have as well documented a history as identifying as what they are, in written records, completely, guaranteed true written records, affirmed by genetics and archaeology, proving that they're all 100% accurate. So it's basically, if you want to say that the English ethnic group doesn't exist, then there are no ethnic groups, and the whole idea of indigeneity is completely fictional. But I think that the idea of indigeneity has been completely corrupted, and it's being used as a political tool to attack white people a lot of the time, because the word indigenous just means native to that soil. It's all it means, and we are indigenous by the literal definition. And if you have some other definition like the UN is promoting, then it's racist against white people, because if you try to redefine what makes a person native to a soil to explicitly exclude just one ethnic group, us, well, there's obviously a racial attack.
Well, thank you very much for all of the wonderful insights that you've given to the audience today. And I would love to ask more questions, and there's plenty more topics I wanted to get into, but we'll have to do that some other time because we are out of time today. And to any of the audience members, please send in questions and comments, and I'll get around to those later. And appreciate you giving us your time, Tom, and we do hope to speak with you again in the future.
I'd be very happy to return. Thanks for having me.